Margaret had always believed that a mother's love was measured by sacrifice. For 35 years, she had put her son, Daniel, before everything else. She worked double shifts as a nurse after her husband passed away, skipped meals so he could attend school trips, and sold her wedding jewelry to help pay for his college tuition. Whenever people praised Daniel for becoming a successful businessman, Margaret smiled quietly. She never reminded anyone of the nights she cried herself to sleep from exhaustion or the dreams she gave up so her son could chase his own. To her, that was simply what mothers did. As the years passed, Daniel married a confident, ambitious woman named Rebecca. At first, Margaret welcomed her warmly, hoping she had gained not just a daughter-in-law but another daughter. Things slowly changed. Family dinners became rare. Phone calls grew shorter. Invitations stopped coming altogether. Whenever Margaret asked if everything was all right, Daniel would smile and say, "You're worrying too much, Mom." She wanted to believe him. Then, one rainy afternoon, Daniel arrived at her house carrying exciting news. "Mom," he said with a wide grin, "Rebecca and I have planned something special for you." Margaret looked up from her knitting. "For me?" "We're taking you to Europe." Her eyes widened. "Europe? I've never even been on an airplane." "I know," Daniel laughed. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. It's finally your turn." Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes. She hugged her son tightly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied. "Just pack your favorite clothes." For the next week, Margaret could hardly sleep. She bought a small travel journal and carefully wrote down all the places she dreamed of seeing someday. Paris, Rome, the Swiss mountains. She even practiced saying a thank you in French after watching videos online. For the first time in years, she felt like life still held wonderful surprises. The morning of the trip, Daniel and Rebecca arrived early. Rebecca smiled politely. "You look beautiful, Margaret." Margaret blushed. "Oh, this old coat? I've had it for years." "It suits you." Daniel loaded her suitcase into the car. During the drive to the airport, they laughed together like old times. Margaret silently thanked God. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the distance she had felt over the past few years was only because they were busy. Maybe everything was finally becoming a family again. At the airport, Daniel parked near the departure entrance. "I'll handle the luggage," he said. Rebecca checked her phone. "Our flight isn't for another hour." They entered the busy terminal. People rushed in every direction. Children laughed. Announcements echoed through the building. Margaret looked around in amazement. "I never imagined airports were this big." Daniel smiled. "They're confusing the first time." He handed her a boarding document. "Mom, Rebecca and I need to go to another counter to fix a problem with the reservation." "Oh. It'll only take 15 minutes." Rebecca nodded. "Stay right here. Don't worry." Margaret smiled warmly. "I'll be waiting." Daniel hugged her. "I'll be back before you know it." She watched them disappear into the crowd. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. An hour. Margaret looked around anxiously. Maybe the line was longer than expected. Another hour passed. She tried calling Daniel. The call went straight to voicemail. She frowned. "That's strange." She called Rebecca. No answer. Again. Voicemail. A knot formed in her stomach. She walked toward the information desk. "Excuse me," as she asked softly. "Could you tell me where the International Reservations Office is? My son went there." The employee pointed her in the right direction. Margaret hurried there. No one had seen them. She searched nearby cafes. Nothing. She searched the waiting areas. Nothing. Her breathing became uneven. She called Daniel again. This time, her phone buzzed with a message. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Don't try to find us. We aren't coming back. We can't take care of you anymore. Figure things out yourself." Margaret stared at the screen. She read the words again. And again. They refused to make sense. Her knees weakened. She slowly sat down on a nearby bench as the noise of the airport faded into a blur. People walked past her without noticing. Families embraced. Friends laughed. Flights departed. But for Margaret, time had stopped. The son she had loved with every part of her heart had left her alone in one of the busiest places in the world, with no money, no ticket, and no idea what to do next. She clutched the phone to her chest as tears rolled silently down her face. In a whisper almost too quiet to hear, she asked herself, "Where did I go wrong?" Margaret spends the entire evening sitting on the same airport bench, hoping Daniel will come back and tell her it was all a terrible mistake. Every time footsteps approach, her heart races, only to sink again when she realizes it's someone else. As night falls, an airport cleaning employee notices that she hasn't moved for hours. Concerned, he gently asks if she's waiting for someone. At first, Margaret is too ashamed to admit what happened. She simply says her family is delayed. Eventually, her emotions overwhelm her, and she quietly reveals that her son and daughter-in-law left her behind without money or a ticket home. The employee informs airport security, not because she's in trouble, but because they want to ensure she's safe. The officers treat her with kindness and escort her to a quiet office where they offer her food, water, and a blanket. One officer asks if she has any relatives or friends she can call. Margaret hesitates before remembering Helen, an old friend she hasn't spoken to in years. Helen answers immediately and is horrified to hear what happened. She promises to come to the airport. While waiting, Margaret keeps replaying memories of Daniel's childhood, his first bicycle, school graduations, birthdays, and the sacrifices she made after her husband died. She struggles to understand how the little boy she raised became a man capable of abandoning his own mother. Helen arrives late that night, embraces Margaret, and takes her home. She reassures her that she isn't alone anymore. The next morning, Margaret discovers that Daniel has blocked her phone number and deleted her from social media. She also learns that several neighbors believed she had already moved overseas permanently because Daniel had told everyone she was leaving the country. The realization shocks her. This wasn't a sudden decision made at the airport. It appears Daniel and Rebecca had carefully planned everything in advance. The chapter ends with Helen urging Margaret to speak with a lawyer to understand whether anything has happened to her home, bank accounts, or legal documents. Margaret agrees, unaware that an even more devastating truth is about to be uncovered. The following morning, Margaret woke up in Helen's guest room, but for a few seconds she forgot where she was. Then the memories came rushing back, the airport, the text message, the empty bench, and the painful realization that her own son had abandoned her. Helen knocked softly on the door. "Good morning," as she said gently. "I made breakfast." Margaret forced a smile. "I'm sorry for bringing all of this into your life." Helen shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for." Friends are meant to stand by each other, especially during times like these. As they sat at the kitchen table, Helen noticed Margaret staring silently into her cup of tea. "I think it's time we find out what's really going on." Margaret nodded. "I need answers." That afternoon, Helen drove Margaret to the office of an experienced lawyer named Mr. Harris. He welcomed them warmly and listened without interrupting as Margaret described everything that had happened. When she finished, he folded his hands together. "Mrs. Wilson," he said carefully, "I need to ask you a few questions." "Of course." "Do you still own your house?" I think so." "Did you recently sign any legal documents?" Margaret frowned. "Daniel asked me to sign some papers a few months ago." "What kind of papers?" "He said they were needed to arrange my travel insurance and some tax documents for our trip." Mr. Harris exchanged a worried glance with Helen. "Do you remember reading them?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "No. I trusted my son." The lawyer sighed. "We need to obtain copies immediately." 2 days later, the documents arrived. Margaret's hands trembled as Mr. Harris carefully reviewed each page. The room became silent. Finally, he looked up. "I'm afraid your son misled you." Margaret's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" These papers were not travel documents. She felt the color drain from her face. "What were they?" "They transferred ownership of your home into Daniel's name." Margaret couldn't breathe. "My house?" Mr. Harris nodded sadly. "He legally became the owner several months ago." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "That can't be true." "I'm afraid it is." She remembered the afternoon Daniel had placed the papers on her dining table. "Mom, just sign here. The travel agency needs everything today." She hadn't even worn her reading glasses. Why would she? She trusted him. As if that news wasn't painful enough, another surprise followed. Mr. Harris continued reading. "There are also documents giving Daniel access to your retirement savings." Margaret looked frozen. "My savings?" "The money you've spent your entire life building." Helen reached across the table and held Margaret's hand. "I'm so sorry." Margaret wasn't crying anymore. She simply stared at the floor. "I never imagined my own child would do this." Over the next week, Mr. Harris began investigating everything. Fortunately, Margaret had signed those papers without proper legal explanation. There were witnesses missing. Some signatures had been placed in the wrong sections. Several requirements required by law had not been followed correctly. "There is hope," Mr. Harris explained. "We can ask the court to cancel these transfers because they appear to have been obtained through deception." For the first time in days, Margaret felt a tiny spark of hope. Meanwhile, Daniel believed everything had gone according to plan. He and Rebecca had already listed Margaret's house for sale. They celebrated over dinner. Rebecca raised her glass. "Finally, we'll have enough money for our dream home." Daniel smiled. No more financial stress. Neither of them imagined that their plans were already beginning to fall apart. Weeks later, the court issued an emergency order preventing the sale of Margaret's house until the case could be heard. Daniel was furious. He called his lawyer immediately. "What do you mean we can't sell it?" "There has been a legal challenge." "But the papers are signed." "The court believes there may have been fraud involved." His confidence disappeared. Margaret never celebrated. She didn't want revenge. She only wanted justice. Every evening she walked through Helen's garden, wondering how life had changed so quickly. One afternoon she quietly asked, "Helen, do you think people are born selfish?" Helen smiled sadly. "No." "Then what changes them?" "Sometimes people love money so much that they stop seeing the people who loved them first." Margaret nodded silently. Those words stayed with her. Months passed as the legal case moved forward. During that time, Margaret began volunteering at a local community centre for senior citizens. She met widows, retired teachers, former firefighters, and grandparents whose families rarely visited. She listened to their stories. Some had been forgotten. Some had been ignored. Others had experienced betrayals similar to her own. Instead of becoming bitter, Margaret found purpose. She organized tea afternoons, birthday celebrations, and reading clubs. Her gentle smile slowly returned. For the first time in years, she realized something important. Family is built through kindness, not only through blood. One evening, Mr. Harris called. "I have good news." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "The judge has reviewed the preliminary evidence. And the court believes your case is very strong." Margaret closed her eyes. After everything she had lost, hope was finally beginning to return. But she had no idea that Daniel's perfect life was already starting to crumble, and before long, he would come looking for the mother he had once abandoned. As the court case reaches its final hearing, Daniel is convinced he will win. However, the judge reviews evidence showing that Margaret signed the property documents after being falsely told they were travel papers. Witness testimony, document irregularities, and Daniel's misleading text message from the airport all point to a deliberate scheme. The court rules in Margaret's favor. Ownership of her home is restored, her retirement savings are returned, and Daniel is ordered to pay legal costs. His reputation suffers, and his business partners begin to distance themselves after learning what happened. Rebecca, who had encouraged the plan, leaves Daniel when their financial situation falls apart. The dream house they wanted is never purchased, and Daniel finds himself completely alone. Meanwhile, Margaret continues volunteering with elderly people who have experienced loneliness and abandonment. She turns her painful experience into something meaningful by helping others regain hope. Months later, Daniel arrives at Margaret's door. He looks exhausted and ashamed. With tears in his eyes, he apologizes and admits that greed destroyed the most important relationship in his life. Margaret quietly listens without interrupting. When he finishes, she says, "I spent my life teaching you that love means giving. Somewhere along the way, you learned that love meant taking." Daniel breaks down in tears. Margaret forgives him because she doesn't want to carry hatred for the rest of her life. But she also makes it clear that forgiveness does not erase consequences. She tells him, "I can forgive what you did. I cannot pretend it never happened." Margaret keeps ownership of her home and updates her will so that part of her estate will support organizations that help abandoned seniors. She also leaves gifts to the friends who stood by her during her darkest days. The final scene shows Margaret celebrating her birthday at the community centre, surrounded by people who genuinely care about her. She smiles as children and seniors gather around to sing a happy birthday. Looking out the window, she reflects. The greatest treasure isn't the family you're born with. It's the people who choose to stand beside you when your world falls apart. The story ends with a message on screen. Respect your parents while you still have the chance. Love given freely should never be repaid with betrayal.